Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar today, which is all about labour and the self-employed. And I'm delighted to say that we are joined by Abena Oppong Asare, who's the Shadow Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury. Good afternoon, Abena.
Good afternoon, Adam and everybody else.
Thanks so much for joining us here today. It's really great to have you on. So we've had, in the past, we've had the Small Business Minister on, of course, from the government benches. We've had Ed Davey on from the Lib Dems, and we've been sort of looking around to get someone from Labour on, and we're really pleased to have someone on from the Treasury team, because so much of our membership and the self-employed more widely are impacted by the policies that come out of the Treasury. So hopefully we can have a good chat today. Now, just in case people don't know, do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself? And you're a new MP, aren't you?
Yeah. So my name is Abena, as you mentioned. I'm a new MP that was elected in 2019 December. So I've just been in my role for just over a year now. I still say that I'm a newbie. I represent Erith and Thamesmead, which is a constituency which falls into London, but part of it, is recognised as Kent as well.
I was going to ask you, do you say it's East London or is it Kent? I was going to ask you about that because it's on that sort of border, isn't it?
So it's South East London. With my address, it says Kent on there. So we can vote in the mayoral London Assembly elections, but I think that it's a really interesting area. Even though it's London, it's also very different to other parts of London. So like outer London and also Kent as well. So some people do recognise themselves as Kent. And so there was a bit of confusion when we were going into tier 4. Sorry, there was concerns about whether we followed the tier changes onto Kent or under London when it's actually London.
Yeah. And how's it been? So you were elected in 2019 at the 2019 election, which was obviously right at the end of the year. And so therefore, for most of your time, almost all of your time, you've been operating under the cloud of the pandemic. Westminster has been shut down for some of that period. It's only partially open now. If you watch PMQs, most MPs aren't there. People are coming in virtually. How's all that been? What's that experience been like?
Yeah, absolutely right about that. So I'd say that for the first almost the first 3 months, it was as normal for us. And when it went to March, we started operating under lockdown. But as a new MP, it takes a while to kind of adjust, because when you come in and you literally are setting up your office completely from scratch, no one really kind of knows that. So we were hot desking in one room, me and a number of new MPs, for up till like mid-February. So we were in the process, a lot of us were in the process of setting up our constituency offices, recruiting staff when the pandemic happened. So and also you're trying to understand how Parliament works. As you've probably noticed, there's unusual kind of etiquette. It's not like a normal workplace in terms of how you speak and getting your head around how you address individuals, because there are formalities that you have to kind of follow. I'm a front bencher now, so the Shadow Exchequer Secretary role. So that means that with certain things I do need to come into Parliament, and we are strongly advised to work from home if possible. So last week, Monday, I had to speak on an SI, statutory instrument, that was going through Parliament, and we can only do those physically. And we also have Westminster Hall debates, and I've been speaking on quite a lot of those in terms of closing them, in terms of being the spokesperson on behalf of Labour. It's only just in the last week, last part of last week, they've now been suspended because of COVID, the Westminster Hall debates. And yesterday I did my question to the Prime Minister virtually, so we can operate in virtual Parliament in that way. But the bill committees, I've been sitting on the Financial Services Bill, so I was sitting on that around until early December for a number of weeks, and that meant that I had to come in every Tuesday and Thursday where we went through the bill line by line, because you can't operate it physically. So there are some things that we have to do we have to go into Parliament, and all my staff have been working remotely, so I hadn't actually met quite a number of my staff who'd been working with me for quite a number of months. We only met, I think, just before Christmas, when we went to support small businesses in the constituency on Small Business Day. That was when I actually physically met some of the team face to face, which was really kind of weird, because you just get used to operating in a virtual way. And also in Parliament, when I do go into Parliament, we still operate a number of our meetings virtually as well. So you'll be sitting in your office on Zoom, communicating with people. In terms of how votes are done, we've all been advised to get proxy votes. So someone will be like the whips will be voting on your behalf. Initially, in the beginning, when we had virtual Parliament, we were able to do the votes ourselves. Yeah, I could go on, but I know you've got other things.
No, it's a good insight. It's a really interesting insight. So thanks for that. I mean, we might as well move on to sort of keeping with the pandemic. But as you will, of course, be aware, one of the great themes of this pandemic, certainly for IPSE, but I think kind of in the general narrative in the media, it's taken up a lot of time, is this issue of support for the self-employed. It's been patchy, there have been gaps, everyone's talked about it. There's been big, well-attended parliamentary debates on this. The all-party group on gaps in support is one of the biggest, most well-attended all-party groups in Parliament right now. What's your sort of analysis of how the government has done on this issue?
So this particular area, in terms of like support for self-employed, is something that I'm particularly quite passionate about, because I have quite a number of constituents who are self-employed. So one of the things that we've done is, as Labour, we've asked for urgent fixes to the furlough scheme, as we feel the Chancellor has excluded it. Again, you know, in my constituency, we have at least 12,000 people that are on furlough. One of the things that I'm particularly concerned about is when the furlough scheme ends, all those people would be at risk of unemployment. And it's something that I have raised in Parliament, concerns about that. In December, when new lockdown measures were introduced, the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, resurfaced after a 41-day absence in Parliament to deliver an economic update that didn't really actually say anything new in terms of support that would be given to those that are self-employed. My colleague Bridget Phillipson, who's on the Treasury team with me, she is the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and she's called on the Chancellor to update the eligibility criteria for those that are on CGRS, so that people who started new jobs after the 31st of October can qualify for support. She's also talked about, the second thing she's talked about was sort out the gaps in SISS, which has been unchanged for almost a year, after it was introduced in haste. Thirdly, she's asked to, which I think is a really good thing, which is to redirect some of the 2 billion in business rate relief, which returned to the Treasury by supermarkets and other large retail businesses, to support those who have been excluded for over 9 months. So we have, as a party, come up with recommendations, and Andy, you probably know this already, but the Federation of Small Businesses has essentially warned that 250,000 small businesses are at risk of folding, putting Britain's recovery at risk. I see it in the cases that come into my office on a daily basis. You know, I have like a self-employed business that has been running since 1983, and that is virtually because of COVID. They're going to be kind of wiped out. And also, further things that are really important is that after the 2008 financial crash, there was research carried out by the Independent Institute for Public Policy Research, IPPR, that showed that small and medium-sized businesses were central to the recovery in labour market, accounting for 84% of jobs. 84% of jobs in a growth between the start of 2010 and the start of 2013. So anyone thinking they're starting a new business, one of the things that I'm really concerned about is they will think twice after seeing how this government treats the self-employed, and that it will damage their recovery. Just on
Listen,
Monday, oh sorry, I can stop now.
no, well, no, I don't. No, please. It's very interesting what you're saying, but I was just going to add to your point there. This is one of the key points that these small business owners make now. Many IPSE members, they're self-employed, but many of them operate through their own company, and some of them will employ people or might intend to employ some people further down the line. And what a lot of these kind of company directors are saying is, look, I can put my staff on furlough. That's great, but what about me? There's not going to be a company left here for those staff to come back to. Those jobs, you mentioned unemployment and the fear that when furlough ends, but if those jobs, if people are on furlough, if the company director isn't being supported and they're shut down, they can't work, then those jobs will have nowhere to go back to. So there's a real pressing need to do something more for company directors, and that's just one group of people. I think that they're one of the gaps. But anyway, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I've already seen it happen with businesses in my constituency. After the previous lockdown in November, they had to lay off staff because they just couldn't financially support them, and they're literally on their last leg. And they actually said to me when I met with them in early December that if they were to go into another lockdown, that's it. They would completely suffer because they were literally on their last leg. I just wanted to say that I've also been meeting individuals. So just on Monday, I met with Sage, who is a software company, who have been talking about the fact that, you know, a lot of these organisations and a lot of you in this call, you know, you have ideas in terms of like how to reach out to people. And as I just mentioned, one of the things I'm concerned about is new people going into self-employment, particularly young people, those changing careers. I'm worried that because of COVID, they might not go into this sector. And so one of the things they've been looking at, and this predates COVID, is trying to get more young people to become self-employed, hosting webinars, training sessions, explaining how they can go into it. I know that this has been a really tough time on self-employed, and you know, I don't feel the government has done enough to help. One of the things that I am on is I'm a commissioner on this new inquiry into future self-employment that's been run by Prospect and Community Living.
Oh, I've given evidence of that inquiry. Yeah.
Right, okay. So it's cross-party. We've got Martin Lewis, who's a money-saving expert, who's also a commissioner as well as me. And as you probably know, Andy, we've been getting evidence from individuals that are self-employed, freelancers, because we're really, really concerned about the impact this is having on people and those that have slipped through the gaps. Andy, I know I can go on a bit, so feel free to stop me.
No, it's fine. I mean, look, just to pick up on a couple of the points that you've made. I mean, one thing that you said earlier on was about the SAYS scheme. I call it the SAYS, and Martin Lewis, who you just mentioned, calls it the SEAS scheme, but the Self-Employment Income Support Scheme. We supported that when it was announced. We actually called for something a bit like it. We started a petition. I think we called it a temporary income protection fund for the self-employed. We had discussions with the Chancellor. They were pretty open with us, and we had heated and difficult discussions, but they were talking to us. And we ended up with the SAYS scheme, and we welcomed it. We could see that it wasn't perfect, but we said, this is great. You know, we had nothing yesterday. Now we've got this. And the government, we have said, did a good job of getting that thing up and running quickly. But it was obvious from the outset that it wasn't perfect. And our hope was, and we genuinely did believe that there would be scope to iron out some of those creases. And as you said, it's been nearly a year, and those imperfections haven't been addressed at all. And there's this sort of blanket response of, oh, well, we know that company directors aren't in it, but we can't do anything because we don't know where their dividends have come from. And yeah, newly self-employed people aren't in it, but we'd be opening ourselves up to fraud if we let them do it. And what we had hoped is that we would get some real discussion going on about how we overcome those hurdles so that we can reach out to these forgotten groups. And that's been the disappointing thing. So we had a really good response, we think, at the beginning, but then disappointing how nothing much has happened since then. That's been I think that's overall our analysis of it. I don't know what if that tallies with what you think.
Yeah, it does actually, and it's the very reason why I got involved in the inquiry just before Christmas, and we did the key findings of the interim report. And the stats, wasn't surprising, but were quite alarming in terms of the fact that over 50% of self-employed workers have said they lost 60% to 100% of their household income last year, and 64% said they were were less likely or unsure if they wanted to continue to be self-employed, and 73% said they were unable to get access to DWP support such as universal credit, and 80% did not believe that the support for self-employed in the pandemic had been commensurate with their tax contribution, which is in line with what you've just said, Andy. So what we've done in relation to those stats is we've called for, and apologies if people already know this, but we've called for an immediate introduction of the self-employment stabilisation scheme, which we feel will complement and build on the existing self-employment income support scheme, which you worked with the government on much earlier. And as you said, it's a new thing. These things do need to change over time, but we think that this particular scheme will help close those existing gaps within the SISS scheme. And this is done in having spoken to people that responded to our survey, roundtable discussions that we've had with self-employed people, and we just think that there needs to be a much more swift action and additional support given to address this economic recovery in 2021 or this year.
Yeah, you mentioned universal credit a minute ago, and we did a bit of research which found there has been an astonishing increase in the number of self-employed people claiming universal credit, 341% increase in the last year. Now, one of the things that the government did during the pandemic is that they suspended this thing called the minimum income floor. I don't know if this is an area that you know much about, but it's a peculiar quirk of the universal credit system that only self-employed people brush up against. And we've always said that it's unfair. So we were very pleased it was suspended, and then we campaigned for that suspension to be extended, which it was. So it was extended in November, I think, until April, I believe. We're going to push for that to be a permanent suspension, basically. Let's get rid of the minimum income floor. I don't know whether you know. I don't want to catch you out. I don't know whether you know. Does Labour have a view on this, or would you support us if we called for that?
Yes. So my colleague Jonathan Reynolds is leading on this. So I think that it's right that the minimum income floor was suspended. The government haven't said when it will come back. And so I've seen that you've said you want it permanently suspended, but I just want to say I think it's important that they do monitor this, and it really shouldn't be brought in an employment crisis, which I'll say is what we're in right now. I also want to say alongside that there are other urgent changes to universal credit that should be made, such as including greater support for homeowners, by reducing the period before a claimant can access to support for mortgage interest. I'm particularly concerned about those homeowners. I see it with the cases that are coming in, how it's just plunging people into further debt. I also think that the government should also make an assessment of whether the saving rules, which excludes people from claiming if they have over 16,000 in savings, because it's hitting self-employed people who might have savings for future tax liabilities, or because they are saving up for house deposit. So when I met with Sage on Monday, they were talking about how a number of their self-employed people, a lot of their money goes into investing in their businesses. So yeah, in terms of your answer about whether the minimum income floor should be suspended, I think it should be, but I do think that the government needs to review it at the moment, and they need to monitor it, and it shouldn't be brought in in an employment crisis, which I say that's what we're in right now.
Well, I'd say, well, yes. Well, speaking of things that shouldn't be brought in an employment crisis, there's another issue which is a big deal to a lot of our members and a big deal to IPSE, which is IR35 and the off-payroll working rules. Now, they were due to come in April of last year, 2020, but the government delayed them because of the pandemic. They could see that the pandemic was coming, so they delayed it for 1 year. So they're now due to come in this April. And I agree, we are in an employment crisis, and these rules are a bit of a work killer, if you ask me. They kill work opportunities. What's your view? What's Labour's view? Labour did support an amendment in the summer, which would have delayed the implementation of these rules for another 2 years. But what's Labour saying now about IR35 and the impending deadline in April?
So we've asked, as you mentioned, for these changes to be postponed during this pandemic. And you're right, because given that it's supposed to be implemented when we're in January now, so February, March, in just 3 months' time, or under 3 months' time, we've asked for the government to actually look into this again, because, you know, we are experiencing the impacts of the pandemic. But I think it's really important we do not commit to cancelling the changes forever. And I say that what we're doing at the moment is we're really kind of like listening to people, self-employed people, particularly individuals in this core, about what their thoughts are on this in terms of what we should be doing, in terms of how we should be addressing this issue, because obviously in terms of what's been happening with this, they're massively impacted. So I just wanted to say that sorry, I was cooking earlier this morning and I had some spices and it's just still in my place. That's why I'm coughing.
Well, everyone's worried about coughing now, so you know, at least it's not, you know.
I thought I'd just clarify that.
Yeah.
And also one of the things I want to say that the government last year, in January, they reviewed the off payroll working rules to determine if further steps should be taken to ensure this implementation. And the review concluded that customers wouldn't have to pay penalties for the areas relating to off payroll rules in the first year, except in cases of non-compliance. And also the Treasury have said that they will continue to monitor and evaluate the operation of this reform. But, you know, I very much believe that we need this approach to be looked at in terms of bringing together tax and employment law.
Right.
This, which should include levelling up protections for those that are self-employed, as well as dealing with aspects of the current tax system that sometimes promote bogus self-employment. And so very much on this, you know, we're very much interested in hearing from individuals affected in this sector, because I know that there are concerns about the introduction of IR35.
Well, can I just say, just because that prompts me to, because I normally say at the beginning, but I forgot, that there is a questions box that you should be able to see, and if you click in there and jotting down any questions that you have for Abena or for me, and we will definitely try to leave some time to address your questions. So please do make use of that questions box. And one question we always get is, will there be a recording of this? Yes, there will be a recording of it. And that will be available, and that will be sent to you along with the feedback form that we send. And there will also, but one thing we can't do is send you the slides, but luckily you're basically looking at the slides right now. There's only 3 slides today, so you're not missing out much on not getting the slides, but the recording will be available to you. Abena, just before we leave the IR35 thing, so you know, you mentioned that review that took place at the beginning of last year. I took part in that review. I was in Jesse Norman's office talking to him about it. It was not the review that we were hoping for. It was a review about, you know, how are we going to do this? How are we going to make sure that this is effective, rather than is this the right policy? That's what we were hoping for. And the compromise that was made around the penalties was, in our view, a bit meaningless, because at the end of the day, you don't really pay a penalty for IR35. It's just a matter of, have you paid the right tax or not, and then you'll have to go back and pay it. So, I think that the underlying problems here still remain. And you also talked about employment rights, and this is a sort of a key issue, and we might get onto this as well. We'll move away from IR35 in a minute, but as you probably know, and as many people watching this will know, once you're deemed to be inside of IR35, you're effectively become an employee for tax purposes only, which means you don't get any employment rights at all. Now, we think that that is an inherent unfairness in these rules. And if you look at what the Matthew Taylor review talked about a couple of years ago, which is still being trumpeted around by government as something that they intend to return to, it talks very much about kind of fairness and consistency at work. And I think what these rules do is they ride roughshod through that principle, and they are going to create an environment whereby a would-be employer can say, do you know what, I don't want to have to give you all these employment rights, but I can make sure HMRC are happy with me, so I'll make sure you're on a payroll somewhere, not my payroll, someone else's payroll somewhere else, and then all that tax is being taken off you, but you're not getting any rights out of me. And I think and we call that zero rights employee. And we were pleased actually to see that several members of the Labour Party during that debate in the summer did use that phrase. And that's one of our big concerns with the IR35 rules, that it is creating this sort of second-class citizen employee type person, paying all the tax, not getting any of the rights. It doesn't seem like that can be right. It doesn't seem like that can be right to me.
Yeah, I mean, I understand concerns about that, and that's the very reason as to part of the reason why we've, as what Labour's done, is asked for these changes to be postponed, particularly during the pandemic, because I don't think that this is a particularly good time to be implementing this without actually looking and doing some further work on this. And also, things are really difficult for people in these kind of circumstances, and this will just add to the other extra pressures. And as I've said, if you can send me information about further things that you feel we should be highlighting specifically with the IR35, very much happy to look into this. And it also links in with what you've just said about the Taylor review, in terms of the best practices, modern work practices that the government put forward through in their review, which I believe was published in 2017.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. But I'll just bring in a couple of questions now, because I'm just looking at them and they're a bit relevant to what we're talking about. So Amrit Pal, who I think's a regular viewer, I recognise the name, it often watches our webinars, says, "Hi Abena, I'm a card-carrying member of the Labour Party. Lost my first ever staff member last year because of COVID making her role not workable. IR35 would mean I can't rebuild and save for new hires. Is the Labour Party working on that root and branch tax review right now?" Was Labour working on a root and branch tax review?
Right now, or before I was appointed, because it was in the summer last year before I was appointed that this issue was kind of looked into. What I say that we're doing right now specifically on this issue is we are listening to people, particularly self-employed people, specifically on this issue, to gather as much information in terms of taking it forward, in terms of what to be addressed. As I mentioned, we've asked for it to be postponed. So, I think for you, Andy, if anyone's got specific concerns they want to raise on this aspect, if they could send you the information so we can look into this. I think it's really important that we do listen to self-employed people on this particular issue and other matters, so we make sure that we do get this right, because as you mentioned, you were involved initially in the early consultation or involved in the discussion on this, where you said to me that it was raised in a way that it wasn't more about penalties, it was more about how to bring in better practices. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, look, I mean, look, we've had a few questions, so maybe if we have a bit of time, we'll just return to give you a bit of that feedback live on what the type of things that people say about it. But let's move on for a minute to that more broader point that we've already touched on around employment status and employment rights. This is a thorny issue. The gig economy kind of sprung up from nowhere in the last 10 years. I think 10 years ago, had I ever heard I don't think I'd heard the expression the gig economy. And now sort of everyone has at least an idea of what it is, or they believe they do. What's the deal? What's going on there? Do you think people are getting the correct rights within the gig economy and in self-employment in general? Have we got this balance right of understanding who is genuinely self-employed, who isn't, and what that means for their tax position and their employment rights?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that I am specifically concerned about in terms of the gig economy, where I think currently the bill we've got in place, particularly the employment bill, doesn't really address the full scourge of the gig economy. But I mean, it does give us a chance to push for all workers to be entitled to essentially what I'd say is basic level of support and protection, as well as greater rights for workers to address the imbalance of power in the workplace. I've got a number of cases that have come in about which actually highlights the perils of the gig economy. So, for example, dealing with a case of an Uber driver who hasn't been able to qualify for SEIS because he has another low-paying job as a school science technician, and this is something
so is he
that
missing out on the 50% rule? So
that's correct.
Yeah,
And I think this is something that I have increasing concerns about. I think that you mentioned this is something that has just come out recently. I think the gig economy has been there for a while, but I think it's increased substantially. But I think also because of COVID, I think we've realised, well, not realised, I think we've seen the lack of support or recognition about the various employment that people do, particularly in this kind of sector. And I think that more support should be done with regards to doing that. And actually, the government should also be looking at some of the recommendations from the Taylor Review, looking how they can implement that to address the difficult issues within the employment statuses.
Yeah, that's the big one, isn't it? That is yet to be addressed. The government has said, "Oh, we like what Matthew Taylor's saying in there," and what he broadly was saying is we need to sort out employment status because at the moment we don't really understand it and it's all a bit vague. So let's have a good think about what's genuinely self-employed, what's definitely employed. Is there a worker status? How do we define that? And then we can move forward with rules that we all agree for each one of those. And that's the bit that the government hasn't done anything on. They did do a consultation on it in 2018, I think, but nothing happened. So we spent ages responding to it, and then nothing happened with it. We now have a situation. The way the situation works right now is that it's all sorts of getting decided in the courts. And there's a big court case with Uber, which you mentioned, which is we're supposed to be getting a judgment at some stage from the Supreme Court, which will be big. But we've had judgments on Pimlico plumbers from the Supreme Court, and there have been others, and it doesn't seem to sort of change anything for everyone else. And so are we getting to the stage, do you think, that we need to take this away from the courts and implement legislation, primary legislation, which says these are the rules, this is how it works. If you meet this criteria or that criteria, you're self-employed, otherwise you're not. And then that's the tax regime within that group, and that's the rights regime for that group as well. What do you think?
I mean, from a personal perspective, I think if we had legislation in place, clear legislation in place, we wouldn't really be having a result of many judgments going forward. And just to go back to what you mentioned about the consultation that the government did with the Taylor Review, the government initially accepted, it was, I believe, 51 out of 53 recommendations, but have only legislated 7. Why is that? And particularly as what we're seeing, and as I've mentioned already, for the cases that I'm getting, we're seeing a rise of insecure work. which is due to the economic fallout of COVID. And so I think it's really important that we revisit this review, because there are so many recommendations that could be looked in terms of like making sure that this is put as legislation. And I have to say that Labour, as we've been waiting for the employment bill to come forward to Parliament, so we're able to properly kind of debate and legislate on these issues. You know, one of the things that I am concerned about is that with this crisis, we're having a disproportionate, seeing a disproportionate economic impact on women, ethnic minorities, young people, and the lowest paid. And what we're also seeing is that a number of people on 0-hour contracts, which I understand has increased substantially, at least to 20%, which is a really high, I believe it's 10.5 million compared to last year. And what we're seeing is that you know, people are feeling like they have to work 0-hour contracts because they're worried if they don't do it, they're not going to get the job in the future, or they'll be, you know, they'll lose, they'll become redundant. So I do feel that the current employment law has left millions left millions of workers without financial support and security, with many working in unsafe conditions. And so that's why I think, you know, we need clear commitment of good work for all in our recovery, which goes as far as creating new high quality green jobs. You know, legislation is important. It also would mean having enhanced employment rights and effective and inclusive employment support measures. So I do feel that legislation is really important to helping us mitigate this. We need to really have a proper, you know, think about how we can make sure the practices are better for people.
Yeah, I think IPSE's view is that we think that we do need some clearer rules now, because you know, if you look at IR35, you've got a situation where no one really understands it. No one understands when IR35 applies or it doesn't. And now all these clients are being asked to make that decision, which is going to impact the tax position of these people and turn them into zero rights employees potentially. And as one guy, Jeff, who's watching our webinar, has sort of said, like, you know, the fundamental principle of assigning the assessment of tax liability to the hiring company will drive the hiring company in only one direction, and that's to remove any risk to themselves, which basically says they're inside of R35, because otherwise I'm at risk. And we agree with that. And if we had some clearer rules, that hiring company might be able to say, oh no, you fall outside of that or inside. The risk for us is that HMRC, being HMRC, would say, well, if we're going to have some hard and fast rules, we're going to make it really difficult for you to be self-employed, because they don't really, we believe they don't really like it. They prefer everyone to be on a payroll. And so that's the difficulty. Do you think that self-employment, because there's been so much talk around this as being, you know, it's worrying and it's dangerous and it means that people are more vulnerable, or is it actually empowering for people? Is it good for people that they can be self-employed, that we do have, although it has dwindled in the last year because of the pandemic, it has to be said, we do have a vibrant and healthy, and until this year growing, self-employed sector? Is that a good thing or a bad thing, or a mixture?
As I mentioned earlier with the stats, what we have seen is the self-employed people contribute a lot to the economy. So I don't see why it would be seen as a bad thing. I think that being self-employed is really, really good. But I just think that there needs to be more support given to those individuals that are self-employed, because, as I mentioned earlier, I'm concerned that what's the lack of support during this particular pandemic may actually put people off continuing to be self-employed, or may actually stop new people coming in to become self-employed. So the data that I mentioned from IPPR showed that actually quite a significant amount of people that are self-employed contribute to the economy. And also I think it's really important to have people working in diverse fields, diverse backgrounds, have diverse thoughts, playing a key role in this. And I think self-employment is really important. And also I think that the work that is being done it helps drive a lot of things. There are times where you would need individuals to do particular certain areas of work, and through self-employment that can be delivered. So I'm very much in support of it. I don't see it as a negative thing, to be honest. I think it's great on the economy. And I also, I just want to say that they contribute.
Yeah, that's really good to hear.
Community.
There is perhaps a view that the Labour Party's a bit more inclined to be a bit wary of self-employment. If you look at a lot of the trade unions, perhaps are a bit reluctant to accept that it can be a good thing, because of course it's a bit of a threat to the way that they work. But from a lot of our members, if you ask them why they go self-employed, they say, because I like the flexibility, I like choosing my own hours. We've seen a big increase in women going self-employed, a big increase in working mothers going self-employed, because managing a full-time employment when you have some other of these responsibilities doesn't suit everybody. And that's why for many people, self-employment is a good option. So it's good to hear that the Labour Party sort of are recognising that. A final question from me, and then we'll move on. This is a bit of a blue sky. It's a bit of a blue sky question. We'll move on to some other quick questions from the attendees as well. Do you think basically self-employment has been growing really steadily for the last 20-30 years, actually, with a particular spike after the financial crisis of 2008? Do you think that we're going, and this is just what you think, it's just not, there's no real policy around this. Do you think that we're going to have more or less self-employed people this time in 10 years time? We have seen a dip in this year because of the pandemic, presumably because of the pandemic. But is that now reversing that trend? Are we going to have less self-employment, or are we going to have more self-employment, do you think?
So Andy, you're asking me to give an answer to the future, which is really difficult. I've learned coming into this role, things are constantly changing. Like, who would have known that we'll be in another lockdown, or like a lockdown like a year ago? I think that it's a really difficult one to call, because I've seen in my constituency actually a number of people turn to self-employment because they've been made redundant from their jobs during this particular period. So there's this woman who I met recently, Rosa Pester, who's actually has since been made redundant. She has started making her own pasta kind of sauce, which she's looking at promoting. So I'm seeing people being creative, but at the same time, with the cases that I am, sorry,
is it pesto sauce? Is it like a
pesto?
Oh
yeah, pesto sauce. Yeah, proper pesto sauce. Sorry, yeah.
It's
it's a home recipe that has been shared down from like generations to generations, and she's now actually turning it into like a small kind of like business thing. Right. And so so in my constituency we have this thing called Abbey Wood Market, which is actually a lot of like self-employed individuals will come and sell their stuff on the stores and stuff like that, and it's all kind of local, which I think is really good. And when I last went there just before Christmas, I saw a number of individuals that were quite new to the scene, and they said to me that because of like COVID, because they've been staying at home, they thought creatively they wanted to do things differently. So like some people have had that mental headspace to think about stuff they wanted to do. At the same time, if you flip on it, I'm also dealing with people, the whole thing's been really stressful, where they've had to lay off staff. They've had to look at different ways they can make income. It's been really, really stressful, where they've seen things like if they have a site, business rates go up, not being able to access the grants to be able to continue their businesses. They've said to me they can't do this anymore. This is just too much high risk. I really, really hope like in the future that we don't see the disappearance of small businesses. You know, I am going to continue lobbying the government to provide more support to small businesses, because I think this is a really testing time for a lot of individuals. And if we don't invest now in terms of giving them the support, we may lose those. And a lot of these people have special skill sets. We will lose those forever, and I don't really want that to happen. And I'm particularly keen to see how particularly young people and individuals that are looking to change their careers, like you know, move from one different self-employment business to another, that they're supported in that. And you know, I don't know if you've seen, you know, I've asked a lot of questions about what support can be given to self-employed individuals. I've also been meeting with self-employed individuals, just hearing firsthand what their concerns are.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks very much. So just before you go, and thanks so much for this conversation. It's been really enlightening, and I've really enjoyed it, and I hope that the attendees have too. And we have had some nice comments on the questions, but just there's a couple of people that wanted me to remind everyone that it was the Labour Party that brought in IR35 originally. Yes, we do know that was back in '99. Gordon Brown, he was the original one. But the Conservative Party haven't been making it any better for the last 10 years. They've been making it sort of steadily worse, and now I believe it's going to be much worse. Other questions are around the CES tool. That's a bit technical, I think, for this one. We will do other IR35 webinars where we will, and we have done them and we'll continue to do them. But I can certainly answer the ones that are directed at me around the CES tool. I can do that. And Jeff, thank you. I'll look out for that LinkedIn note that you've sent me around the CES tool. Aslam says, as the Lord said, IR35 is not fit for purpose. Why is that report brushed under the carpet? I don't know if you saw that one, Abena. That was a report from the Finance Bill Subcommittee, the Finance Bill Subcommittee, House of Lords, which is chaired by Lord Forsyth. And he came out with a damning report around IR35. It came out in around about March time or April time last year. I don't know if you saw it, but it's worth having a look if you didn't.
Yeah, I need to look at that.
The government did, I think, that brush it under the carpet, Aslam, is one way of saying it. I agree. They just didn't really react to it at all. They just said, well, that's what you think and we think differently, basically. David has said the government's reform of 16 to 19 further education, which includes the introduction of T levels, completely ignores self-employment. Can Labour highlight this issue, please? Is that one that you're, or could maybe you could raise that with your colleagues?
Yeah. Sorry, what's the question? Do you mind just dropping me an email, Andy? So
yes,
with the person that's raised it, so I can make sure I can send it to you so you can give it to the right person.
Yeah, sure. So this is David, who I think I know, and David, if I'm right, you're the David from the Musicians Union, and David's asked a question about the government's reform of 16 to 19 further education, which includes the introduction of T levels, completely ignores self-employment. Can Labour highlight this issue, please? But I will send you that question along with all of the questions, Abena, and if there's anything that you can do to sort of raise them with your colleagues, it would be much appreciated.
Yeah.
The gig economy will be bigger after COVID. More people will be drivers, warehouse workers, etc., says Jay. So these are just comments, really, people joining in with the chat, but I thought I'd just feed them back to you.
Yeah. So, sorry, that question, that was it David that raised that question?
Yeah.
It's funny because one of the colleges from my constituency has actually raised that question, and we've got a meeting with the minister about that, just to talk about specifically more of a kind of a local issue, but it's something that translates nationally. But if you send me the specific question, I can also speak to my colleagues who lead on that particular policy area, just to find out exactly what work they're doing on this.
Great, I will do. Thanks very much. Well, look, I think that brings us to the end of our time. So, and apologies that I was interrupted by a phone call a minute ago. I should have turned that on silent. I forgot to do it this time. Thanks everyone for watching, and thank you for your comments and questions. And thank you very much to Abena, who has been a great sport and stayed with us for longer than I think I might have told her office that we might keep her here for.
I didn't
And you
realise the
had a
time.
really,
I was enjoying it so
rushed
much.
in here as well from an important COVID meeting with your colleagues too. So
Yeah.
thanks so much for being generous with your time and for a really interesting conversation.
Thank you. And I'm so sorry for coughing. I was trying to drink my vitamin C today.
No, that's okay. It's just that when you cough, people worry these days, don't they? But
I know, you
as
feel
long as you're okay, Abena, as long as you're all right, you're
yeah.
not, there's no symptoms, you're all right. Yeah. It's the spices, the breakfast spices.
The spices, which I haven't eaten yet because I've been meeting, so I need to go and eat it in a minute. I was trying to do an omelette this morning with some spices and the smells and the, yeah.
Well, enjoy that. Okay, thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you. Take care, bye.
Bye.